think of ourselves as the most powerful beings in the universe, it's unsettling to discover that we're wrong. Time has come to see the world as it is.
Can we pull back the veil of static and reach into the source of all being? Behind this curtain lies this random pattern generator. You will be responsible for an escalation that will destroy everything.
Even though video games may seem like a futile, pointless waste of time to a lot of people, they have enhanced my life experience in ways I can't adequately describe in language. In fact, my spirits assert that interactive experiences like video games are one of the most important things to happen in the development of human consciousness recently. My spirit contacts assert that some types of video games are a complete waste of time, mostly online multiplayer shooters, but that others are very important and can even be magical in a way. Basically, if a video game has you doing the same repetitive things over and over again, like many competitive online games, then it's probably a waste of time and energy. But if a game possesses a narrative and a progression, a journey or culminating series of events, obstacles, and challenges, then it can be very useful not only for cognitive development, problem-solving skills, spatial relations, and staving off Alzheimer's disease, but also for a host of spiritual and magical reasons. If a game involves what is called player agency, then it is on a whole different level. Now, someone on a message board I looked up put it this way, quote, "Agency is the level of control that a player feels they have in a game world. Games with minimal agency are like those on-rail shooters where your only choice is either to shoot or die. Games with a lot of agency are more difficult to define. One example might be Dragon Age, where the choices you make at each major plot point significantly affect the narrative. My spirits say that games that combine player agency with decisions that have moral consequences, like the Mass Effect series, are on an even higher level. And they say that open-world RPGs with player agency, games like Bethesda's Skyrim and Fallout 4, are on the highest spiritual level, becoming downright magical. Another way to look at video games in a spiritual light is that if you magically invoke before playing the game, and set your intentions to allow the game's experience to have a spiritual effect on you, then it is very possible that your journey through and trials within the game will act as what could be called a shamanic journey through the challenges of the underworld, which is a very prevalent aspect of psychoactive initiation practices throughout the ages and across the world. So, if you don't have access to a trusted and skilled shaman who can guide you through a very strong psychoactive experience like an ayahuasca trip, and in the modern Western world very few of us do, then magically invoking a video game experience can act as a lesser sort of surrogate of the shaman's trials in the underworld. The game experience would have to involve strife and challenges of some sort, whether it is the absurdly challenging and frightening bosses in Bloodborne, or conquering the brain-teasing puzzles of horror games like Silent Hill or Amnesia. It wouldn't work so much, however, if the game was something without much conflict or obstacles like The Sims or indie relaxation games like Flower or Flow. It actually helps this magical process if the game is more frightening and difficult, making the aforementioned horror games ideal choices. In addition to this, I've merged magic and video games in my life in another way. Years and years ago, I decided to create a scenario where practically every game I play fits into the same universe and features the same protagonist, and every individual game is just another part in an ongoing story with no end in sight. It's the story of a man who is being sent from one reality to the next, oftentimes incarnating as different people. It's sort of like Quantum Leap meets the concept behind that unfortunate 90s show Sliders. It all started out with my obsession with being stranded in space on a giant abandoned ship. The British sci-fi comedy show Red Dwarf follows this basic premise and, to this day, remains one of my favorite TV shows. One day while playing the game Dead Space, which takes place on a massive abandoned mining ship in space, just like Red Dwarf, I noticed that once I had cleared a certain level of all the enemies, I could just wander around the whole area without being attacked. It made me feel just like Dave Lister, Red Dwarf's main protagonist in Last Human Alive. I would create a save for each level after clearing it out, and then drop some LSD or psychedelic mushrooms. I would then wander around this gigantic abandoned mining ship while tripping and live out my bizarre fantasy of being the last human alive on a massive spaceship. But I began to think, however, how did he get here? I wanted him to be far from home, not only in the sense of space and time, but also reality. So I wanted the reality of the giant ship to be in a different reality than the one he came from. I decided that some benevolent godlike being had placed him there as a sort of hiding place, and created the concept that he had been cascading across many realities, being guided by this deity, while they both try to outrun a terrible and destructive monolithic force of darkness, something which was involved somehow in the protagonist being torn from his own world. To fill out the backstory of his journey throughout different realities before heading out on the ship, I played a series of action games and pretended that each one was a new reality he was thrown into. These included the Half-Life games, the Resistance games, and the Crisis games, all of which involve humanity desperately fighting an overwhelming alien invasion. After I narratively got to the point of him arriving on the lonely ship, I decided to keep the story going, and have been doing so for years and years. I kept a sketchbook of sorts to document all the different worlds, wars, and events, and after doing this for about a year or so, I decided to record the whole thing as a written story. As I record this podcast now, that ongoing story is about 600 pages. Now, to get how I integrated Magick into this, I decided to assign certain archetypes, certain gods and goddesses, as ongoing enemies in this whole strange narrative. One was a warlord god, the god of men like Napoleon, Alexander the Great, Winston Churchill, and Patton. Another was a god of domination, rape, and patriarchy, the god of ruthless rulers and despots. Another was a goddess of dark magic, magic that uses and abuses nature and natural forces. Another was a god of nightmares and fear. The main villain, the pursuing force of darkness, I decided was a god of ultimate death. Well, actually, decided isn't the right word. Over time in these games I played, it was pointed out to me that it was. I know that sounds crazy, but it just did. Not a positive death deity like the ones who represent change and evolution now. No, this guy is all about the end of all life forever and ever. Often manifests as an oily darkness, a black cloud. Think the Nothing in the Never-Ending Story, or the smoke monster in Lost. As time went on, my list of enemy deities grew. Every time I played a game which featured a villain or enemy force which seemed to be aligned with one of these archetypes, my actions against them and eventual defeat of them in the game would then magically translate to me hurting or lessening those negative forces in our real world. My spirits assured me this was really happening. Eventually, my spirits urged me to look into existing pantheons of deities and find parallels to my own cast of villains. The parallels were frighteningly accurate. Perhaps I'll get into that in a future episode. But as time went on, I also found myself adding benevolent deities who were there behind the scenes to help my protagonist in his ongoing odyssey. Then, benevolent non-player characters who paralleled these good deities began showing up in the games I would play. Something else began happening. Some of the negative deities would defect to the other side. It would happen symbolically in the games I was playing, and I would also feel it spiritually. Eventually, I was even able to communicate with some of these newly turned deities. My spirits told me that, in the greater scheme of things in the world, I wasn't necessarily utterly destroying these deities or changing them permanently for everyone who could ever experience them, but that I was helping them in some way and also gaining their favor as protectors and helpers. Over the years, former enemy deities have protected me and helped me many times and in many ways. And remember that deities tend to have higher and lower aspects. For instance, a lower aspect of the warlord god would be like Hitler, whereas a higher aspect would be like, Winston Churchill. However, I should say, I will never turn or befriend the ultimate enemy in this whole strange new process. The deity of ultimate death is an eternal enemy. There is no good in them whatsoever. In fact, if somebody asked me to define who and what the devil could ever possibly be, it would be this force. The synchronicities that have occurred over the years in the games I've played, and also in my real life, have been absolutely astonishing, sometimes downright frightening. I came to call those never-ending story moments, referring to the fantasy movie from the 80s, where, as the boy reads more and more of the magical book, it starts to spill into his reality with wild synchronicities and eventually full-on manifestation. My spirits assured me that this was all really happening. I wasn't going crazy, or merely seeing patterns that weren't there. This new magical act involving video games and story writing was truly changing me and the world around me. Eventually, I decided to call this practice juegomancy, from the Spanish word juego, which means game or play. Video game-mancy just doesn't roll off the tongue quite as well. And I've had a very hard time describing to my friends what juegomancy is, let alone expressing to them what this whole life-changing, reality-shattering process has been like and how mind-blowing it really is. And as a kind of side note, I guess I'll say the games that have been the most magical to me are Half-Life 2, the Metro series, Skyrim, Fallout 3, New Vegas, and 4, the Dark Souls and Bloodborne series, BioShock and BioShock Infinite. BioShock Infinite was especially indescribable. Not just as a great game, but also magically. I have no words for what that was. And also the Portal games. I want to add that I'm going to be citing from a news source for some of the news, which is esoterics.com, esoterx.com. And now the news.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
In 1902, on the 28th of October, in the early hours of the morning, the lookout on the SS Fort Salisbury, located in the Gulf of Guinea, some distance off West Africa in the South Atlantic, saw a huge dark object to starboard. He called the second officer, and together with the helmsman they watched the strange submarine craft. Second Officer Raymer later recalled, "It was a little frightening. We couldn't see too much detail in the darkness, but it was between 500 and 600 feet in length. It had two lights, one at each end. A mechanism of some kind, fins maybe, was making a commotion in the water. The surface of the craft appeared to be scaled rather than smooth, and the object was slowly sinking. This sounds almost like a giant sea creature, except that at 500 to 600 feet it would be impossibly huge, and also it is unlikely to have had a light at each end. Is it likely to have been a terrestrial submarine? They were being developed around this time. The first British submarine was launched in 1901, but it is unlikely that these early craft could travel so far away from land. To the east of Africa, the only recorded location of USO sightings we know of is the island of Reunion, where on 10th February 1975, a man at Petite Île saw a very bright object come up out of the sea and fly off very fast. Further east, somewhere in the Indian Ocean, the fourth officer on board Queensland Star saw a white UFO in the sky which dropped and entered the sea, making the water very bright. Particles of a white substance fell into the sea after the UFO had sunk. This happened on the 18th of September 1961. Mysterious submarines have also been seen around Australia and New Zealand. On the 11th of April 1965, two men on the cliffs at Wonthaggi, Victoria, Australia, watched two strange craft for 15 minutes. They identified them as submarines by their conning towers, but a Navy spokesman commented, "A preliminary investigation of the report suggests, in view of the locality and configuration of the coastline, that the objects are unlikely to have been submarines." Only 4 days later, two youths saw two cylindrical objects off Coolum, Queensland, and 3 days after that, two fishermen were chased by a big vessel off Mooloolaba, near Brisbane, Queensland. There was a further sighting of two objects in the sea off Fraser Island, Queensland, on the 6th of June 1965. They were dark, narrow, and up to 100 feet long. The witnesses, in a plane, saw 2 or 3 smaller objects near the big ones. Mystery submarines were also seen off New Zealand in 1965, and the first sighting predated the Australian ones, taking place on the 12th of January in Kaipara Harbor, north of Helensville. A DC-3 was flying at 500 feet over the harbor when the captain saw a stranded whale, which on closer examination he saw to be a metallic structure about 100 feet long and resting in 30 feet of water. The Navy confirmed that it could not have been a conventional submarine because of the inaccessibility of the location. Later that year, on the 13th of November, two fishermen on their way to tend cray pots off rugged islands at the northwest of Stewart Island saw a strange tower emerge from the sea 300 yards away. There was a box close to it. After a few seconds, the water surged and the objects disappeared. The men were sure they had not seen a submarine conning tower, or whales or logs, and the Navy confirmed that it was an unlikely place for submarines to operate because of the rocks in the area. An identified submarine surfaced off Kumliena Beach near Seduna, South Australia, on the 28th of December, 1976, and was seen by about 20 Aboriginals who were fishing at the beach. The craft was about 90 feet long and had a white conning tower, a black center line, and a red stripe at the waterline. But a Royal Australian Navy spokesman said that submarines are usually dark in color, and the details did not match any of the submarines in the world's navies. Also, no craft were operating in those waters at the time. Furthermore, USOs have been reported from various places off East Asia, the most southerly being Vietnam, where on the 16th of June 1909, an elongated bolide, or meteor fireball, was seen by fishermen over Dong Hoi City, Annam, in the early hours of the morning. They saw it fall into the sea after it had been visible for 8 or 10 minutes, which rules out its being a meteor. The crew of an American craft off Incheon, South Korea, saw two objects with smoke trails which struck the water at great speed, sending up huge columns of water. This happened in December 1950, and a few years later, on the 15th of January 1956, a large object glowing blue-gray was seen to fall into the water off Pusan, South Korea. The glow was visible for an hour and a half as the object floated on the surface before sinking. Strange objects were seen descending into the sea off Japan in both 1956 and 1957, and a more recent sighting of a USO took place in 1980. On that occasion, actually on the 18th of August 1980, the captain of a Russian research vessel in the Sea of Japan saw a metallic-looking cylindrical object rise slowly from the sea and hover nearby before shooting away. On August 8th, 1993, in Belgrave, Victoria, Australia, sometime after midnight, Kelly Cahill, a 27-year-old mother of 3, and her husband were heading home after visiting a friend in the Dandenong foothills when they saw a craft hovering silently above the road in front of them. The craft was round with windows around it and lights on the bottom. Just as Kelly told her husband that she thought she saw people in there, the craft shot off to the left and disappeared. But a kilometer away, they encountered a light so bright that Kelly had to hold a hand to her brow to see better. Quote, "What are you going to do?" she asked her husband, her adrenaline pumping. "I will keep driving," he said, and the next moment, Kelly, suddenly perfectly calm, said to her husband, "What happened? I swear I had a blackout." By the time they got home, Kelly realized she smelled of vomit and felt she had lost an hour of time. She found a triangular mark on her navel that night, and in the weeks that followed she entered the hospital twice, once for a uterine infection and the second time for severe stomach pains. Later, Kelly consciously remembered that when the road had curved ahead of them, the light that they had thought was in front of them on the road was actually on the right at the bottom of a gully in a field. The object was massive, about 100 feet wide. Kelly had asked her husband to stop the car. They had both gotten out, crossed the road, and seen another car stop down the road. All of a sudden they saw an all-black figure in the field, about 7 feet tall and not human. Its eyes were big like a huge fly's and glowed red. Then she realized that there were heaps of them in the field. One group of beings approached them rapidly as if gliding, while another group approached the people in the other car down the road. Kelly had a sense that the beings were evil, that they lacked souls. Struggling to stay conscious at this point, she heard her husband say, "Let go of me!" And suddenly she felt herself getting sick. Later, an angry and frightened Kelly screamed at the creatures. The next thing she remembered was being back in the car. Kelly experienced a series of dreams about the encounter. In one, she saw the being leaning over her, as if he was about to kiss her navel. The creature was tall, had a larger than normal head, long thin arms, a bulging abdomen, and skin like gray-black plastic. The creature was black, said Kelly, but not the color black. It was as if someone had cut a hole in matter, or he stood, or as if he himself was a hole in space. The independent witnesses in the other car have confirmed Kelly's description of the object and the beings, except that they did not recall the creature's red eyes. A similar all-black being with long arms was seen in Leicester, England in the summer of 1928. This article is called Dog Deaths on Overtown Bridge, the most dangerous place on earth for depressed pets. It was posted to esoterics.com on April 26, 2013 at 7:22 p.m. Overtown Bridge near Milton, Scotland, is an unassuming little Victorian granite arch bridge built in 1895 to span the Overtown Burn, Scottish for stream. In Celtic mythology, the Overtown area was known as the Thin Place, where the boundaries between heaven and earth were somewhat closer than usual, and many legends associate the location with tragedy, including a crazed father tossing his possessed child off the bridge. That is reputedly the sole human casualty. Dogs have not been so fortunate. Reportedly, Labradors, Collies, and Retrievers, incidentally all long-nosed breeds, have been inexplicably hurling themselves off the Overtown Bridge since at least the 1950s, at the rate of roughly one a month. Over 50 dogs have perished from the 50-foot fall into the rocks below the bridge, and nearly 600 have tried. Some hounds that survive the fall then merrily try to jump again. Most of the dogs jump from the same spot on the bridge, between the last two parapets on its right side. While doggy depression is not an unknown phenomenon, it would stretch credulity to assume that there are that many Scottish dogs that just can't take it anymore. I would be more inclined to believe it if someone told me there was a problem with collie alcoholism in Scotland. Various unsatisfying explanations have been offered by the intrepid scientists brave enough to look into these things, from particularly strong mink scents in the brush underneath Overtown Bridge, to transference of owners' depression to canine companions. You would think that after the first, 10 dogs tossing themselves off the bridge, local dog owners might have gotten the message and found another walking path, but I guess it required another 590 attempts to firmly establish the reality in people's minds. Skepticism is a reasonable natural stance when approaching to the supernatural, but completely ignoring the statistical pattern of attempted doggy suicide seems rather foolhardy. In Columbia, Tennessee, a man in Maury County says that he saw an unidentified bird he believes could be a thunderbird. 43-year-old teacher L. Broyles told Cryptozoology News he was driving when he saw the animal at about 1:30 p.m. October 28th. It was light brown and the wingspan was 10 to 12 feet, he said. Broyles claims the sighting lasted about 1 minute and that he has never seen anything like it before. The bird, he adds, was feathered. He did not mention any features about its head or beak. Thunderbird, also known as rock, is the nomenclature used by Native Americans to refer to bird-like creatures with reptile features that are believed to be related to the extinct pterosaurs. Following is a user-submitted report being posted in its entirety. Name, Shane R. Country, USA. City, Wilkes-Barre. State, Pennsylvania. Date of sighting, summer 2016. How long did the sighting last? Less than 30 seconds. What were you doing at the time of the sighting? Quadding in the mountains close to home. Describe what happened with as many details as possible. It was a warm, sunny day. I decided to go on a quad ride by myself, as I usually do, when time allows. As a business owner, this is my way to relax. Seems like my only hobby for a man of 50 years young. It must be said, when I'm traveling on my quad, I go very slowly, no hurry to get to my destination or to spook any wildlife. After an hour of this journey, I'm traveling on an old railroad bed, once heavily used for coal mining that has been removed for some time. This is not a typical path, but a wide dirt road. 2 jeeps could pass each other with no problems. To set the location, on the outskirts of the city in the mountains. A beautiful place in Pennsylvania. Anyway, as I came around the bend, I must have startled a huge bird taking a drink from a large puddle on the path. These puddles in this area remain year-round. I never saw the bird struggle to take off when I saw it. It was already flying away from me. Its wings were out already and soaring. Even though I traveled in stealth mode, my quad was still loud enough to hear, just enough time for the bird to take off. As soon as my brain realized what I was seeing, I hammered on the throttle to keep up. It was no more than 50 feet in front of me and at 4 feet off the ground, as I am sitting. It was a very warm and sunny day with the sun over my right shoulder. I could see this bird was jet black with feathers like a crow or raven. It was so black that the sun brought out a bluish-purple tinting on the wings. I believe I have a tape measure eye, at least compared to most people. This bird had a 10 to 12 foot wingspan and a pretty thick body. My vantage point bearing down on it from behind was unreal. This was no turkey vulture. I've seen many, even up close. I am no bird expert at all, but I am fascinated by hawks. Just love to watch them when I'm out. This was something I felt did not belong, and most importantly did not want to be seen, unlike other birds. Obviously I didn't see the head, but as it was incredibly large. To put it into perspective, in a dream state, you would think you could ride this beast, and this is only from seeing it fleeing just in front of me. When I think about the wings, I would say that I only weigh 165 pounds, and if I needed wings to fly, they would have been that large. As I tried to gain pace with the bird, I knew I would not be able, because from where that bird was drinking, the puddles ahead would slow me down for sure. I shortly stopped to watch this bird traverse the now winding trail. It had still remained about 4 feet off the ground, and it seemed as if it never removed its wings or even tried to gain altitude. There was no desperate flapping of the wings like a vulture or any bird I can think of. It was literally gliding through the forest on that seemingly small path at this point, almost like a plane. After it was out of sight, I knew the path up ahead would split, one going down the mountain and one going up. It is certain to me that the bird glided down the mountain path to gain the altitude it needed. I tried to get another vantage point to see it again, but I failed. To me, I can't ever see a bird that size being able to utilize the woods for any kind of shelter. There is no way it could fly in there unless it walks on the ground a lot. And why wouldn't something that large be seen flying around? This incident occurred almost a year and a half ago, but still haunts me. I can't seem to shake it. Since then, my quad rides have been in one direction only, towards my sighting. I come to find out birds are extremely territorial, and if that's true, I hope I get to prove it someday. Mercerville, New Jersey. A former law enforcement officer claims he saw an unidentified flying animal. He was on his back porch when the purported creature flew by on January 18th. Quote, "It was flying from the east towards the west in a northwest direction at 5:20 p.m., he said. Reportedly, the unusual being had 2 sets of wings. Quote, "It had a regular one and another set of smaller wings at the end of the body." The uniformly gray-colored body, the New Jersey resident added on a MUFON report, was slender and long and it was headless. Quote, "I couldn't see a beak either. It didn't have legs or feet. It was about 10 feet long and thin like a snake. Its wings, very thin and long, moved like an eel or snake." The reported creature was flying above the neighborhood trees when the eyewitness lost sight of it. He claims that it was not a drone, as it was not mechanical in nature, and that it moved through the air like a sea creature would move through the water. Quote, "I am familiar with anything that moves around us in our natural habitat," said the retired police officer. This was not any natural earthly flying creature. On July 2nd, 1953, at 1300 hours, at Viares de Sá, Spain, approximate date, an illiterate boy cowherd, Maximo Munoz Olivares, 14, saw a big balloon on the ground behind him when a faint whistling attracted his attention. Shaped like a water jug, it was metallic. Through an opening came 3 dwarfs 60 centimeters tall, with yellow faces, narrow eyes, and oriental features. They spoke in a language he could not understand. They were dressed in blue, had a sort of flat hat with a visor in front, and a metal sheet on their arms. One of them smacked the boy's face, then they re-entered the machine, which glowed very brightly, made a soft whistling sound, and went off like a rocket. Footprints in 4 holes 5 centimeters deep, forming a perfect square 36 centimeters inside, were found by police. July 31st, 1953, 1900 hours, Wolin, Poland. A metal object, 30 meters in diameter, was observed by 5 Polish and 2 German workers as it landed in a field close to a railway. It was shaped like a sphere with a flat disc around it, showing numerous openings at the periphery. On August 16th, 1953, at 20:30 hours in Tours, France, Claude Pasquier saw 2 discs flying very low, quite slowly, along a straight course with a hard sound. Now some strange events from Czechoslovakia. In Bratislava, poltergeist outbreak, 11th to 13th of August 1927. In Brno, military moon watched light in sky which would disappear then reappear elsewhere. Tracked on radar and jet scrambled, but UFO always disappeared each time jet approached, and after an hour disappeared for good, 1960. In Holtiansky Nemec, retired pilot saw UFO traveling fast over mountains, April 1955. In Kolshica, glowing red and black spheres seen hovering over towns and villages, 1st September 1965. At Kulstenstein-Hügel, poltergeist outbreak, August to November 1927. In Kulterbach, poltergeist outbreak, several days in July 1927. Linar, witness saw 4 shining discs in straight line, which were replaced by 12 spheres arranged 6 by 6. They divided into 2, and all flew away at speed, 14th August 1965. At Nikolsburg, Nikolov, near Brno, poltergeist outbreak, October 1927 to summer 1928. In Sitzowitz, 3 girls saw apparitions of Blessed Virgin Mary, June and July 1948. At Mount Snezka, couple climbing on mountain got lost in snowstorm and were led to safety by shining blue ball which appeared near them, November 1977. At Snopusov, women and grandchildren saw 2 domed UFOs which came down, sat motionless in sky for several minutes, gave off smoke, then took off, emitting bright light, 1st July 1966. At the Tatra Mountains, man and boy followed by showers of stones, indoors as well as out, August 11th, 1927.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
That was a public service announcement designed to scare the shit out of you.
Now to mention something else regarding video games and magic. I've been using the aforementioned occult techniques and perspectives for years now to enhance my experience with video games that, along with psychedelics, has created an indescribably amazing series of synchronic adventures and experiences which bleed into my physical and dream lives. But until recently, I had never used such practices to actually aid my plight in a game. I just want to side note, this is something I wrote years and years ago as opposed to the first part of this episode which I had just written. My plight in the game I'm playing now, Minecraft, involves getting a certain amount of ender pearls in order to open a portal which leads to the end of the game. These rare objects are randomly dropped by relatively scarce enemies which can instantly escape you pretty easily if they want to. Before sitting down in front of the game, I performed a bit of visualizing after invoking, with my desired outcome in mind. I felt something extremely powerful explode in the room at the climax of the act, as I almost involuntarily envisioned a bright white light surge in the room, blinding out all darkness. I felt buzzed out and a bit wacky from the events as I started playing the game. In that hour or so, I wound up finding and collecting 5 of those damned ender pearls. Whereas in the whole time I had previously been playing the game, about a month, I had found only 1 of the elusive objects. And as I've said before with magical experiments, I can't say that it definitely did work, but I can certainly say that it didn't not work. I mean, I was swimming in ender pearls that day, when I could go for weeks previously without seeing a single one. And when I would, cast doubt about this, my spirits would get impatient with me and just, insisting, of course it worked, you idiot, come on.
He was abducted by aliens earlier this afternoon. That little girl got lost under the bed and she went into an alternate dimension.
This article is called More Than 20 People in Yukon, Canada Saw This in the Sky, a Worldwide Phenomenon. It was posted to collectiveevolution.com on April 17th, 2015 by Arjun, Walia. One great example of strange objects that are commonly seen in the sky comes from the Yukon, a province in Canada situated on the northwest side of the country. It's a remote area, nowhere near any major cities or populated areas. This reported sighting happened on December 11th, 1996 near a place called Fox Lake. It's extremely cold in this part of the country at this time of year. It's not far from Alaska. And again, it is hundreds of miles from any major city or heavily populated public area. According to more than 20 witnesses, a very large aerial object with very bright lights hovered near the Fox Lake area between 8 p.m. and 9 p.m. Canadian engineer Martin Jasek, who wrote a detailed account of the event after he investigated it for himself, quote, "Two of the witnesses were cousins driving in separate vehicles. Each saw it over the lake, slammed on their brakes, and got out of their vehicles. They watched the huge object as it drifted slowly towards one of them and was soon almost directly overhead. It then moved slowly across the highway and over a hill to the east, whereupon it was lost to view. While the two cousins were observing this object, a married couple with their baby were a bit farther to the south along the same highway driving toward them. They too saw the object. By the time they caught up with the cousins and pulled over, the object had moved off. The married couple continued driving until they arrived at a lodge farther ahead. There, they told the owner about what they had seen. He promptly recounted a sighting from an earlier witness who had gotten very close to this object. At the nearby village of Pelly Crossing, other people described the same object. In one case, it seemed to respond to a man's flashlight by accelerating towards him. When he turned off his flashlight, the object stopped. But then it had gotten quite close to him, filling much of the sky. It also emitted several beams of light, including one that swooped along the ground. They ran across a clearing, perhaps to get a better view. When he turned to look for the object, it was gone. This is one out of many extraordinary sightings that has occurred around the world, and judging by ancient artwork and history, it seems to have been happening for a very long time. One example would be, for example, the Aboriginal community in Canada. Their stories have not been passed down through documentation, but through an oral storytelling tradition. These stories often speak of spiritual beings from another world. Here's a quote from an Ojibwe author called Richard Wagamise or Wagamise. "My people tell of star people who came to us many generations ago. The star people brought spiritual teachings and stories and maps of the cosmos, and they offered these freely. They were kind, loving, and set a great example. When they left us, my people say there was a loneliness like no other.
Time has come to see the world as it is.
This article is called Deepak Chopra Launches Response to a Wikipedia Controlled by Quote-Unquote Skeptics. It was posted to realitysandwich.com in 2015, and it was written by Faye, Sakellaridis. Deepak Chopra, along with other leading advocates of non-local consciousness, has been at the receiving end of attacks by self-described skeptics on Wikipedia, and he's had enough. In response, today Chopra announced a new collaboration with researchers and historians on an integrative studies online archive. The initiative will be a donation to Wikipedia, with the goal of encouraging a healthy cooperative dialogue. Writing today in the Huffington Post, Chopra said, quote, "Most have simply washed their hands of the problem, claiming that the bigotry or bias on Wikipedia is just an unfortunate side effect that we have to accept. But this is not a trivial, unintended consequence of an open source system. Bias goes against the very principle of Wikipedia and must be addressed. I have to deal with this bias and misinformation every time a journalist interviews me and references my Wikipedia article. I need to spend the first 30 minutes of interviews to correct all the misleading information from my Wikipedia article. It doesn't matter how many reliable sources are submitted, nor how well supported certain facts about my life are, if it doesn't fit within the narrative of extreme skepticism of the band of editors controlling my Wikipedia page, it is quickly removed. And the editors who complain of this censorship are harassed or banned. What should we do about this? Surely this is not an acceptable way to handle sensitive topics on an encyclopedia that holds neutrality as its central pillar. I even explored ways to see if we could just delete these articles on Wikipedia. If they cannot responsibly and accurately handle publishing sensitive topics and biographies, maybe it is best they just remove them. Wikipedia has blocked even this simple remedy. Recently, I have obtained a new perspective. A group of researchers and archivists approached me a while back to explain how Wikipedia works and offered to mediate. They informed me that the problems that are occurring are not because of Wikipedia's rules and policies, but despite them. Wikipedia's purpose is to overcome these prejudices and misrepresentations, though the path there is tedious and long. They informed me that the best way to handle this issue was not by exposing the bias of Wikipedia editors, which they are already aware of, but to be patient and continuing to contribute information faithfully and genuinely, seeking to represent knowledge and nothing more. And that, in time, the article will become a fairer and more accurate representation. When I actually reviewed Wikipedia's sensible guidelines, not only was I impressed with how forward-thinking they were, I realized that their neutrality policy is likely the best way to approach what some consider very controversial topics, especially topics that I discuss frequently, such as consciousness, wellness, and lifestyle. I was relieved to see that Wikipedia was not meant to be the ideological battleground that a large number of skeptics have made it into, that Wikipedia belongs to you and me just as much as it belongs to them. Those editors only have that much control because they have mastered the Wikipedia rules and learned how to use them to their advantage. This team of researchers and historians has now formed the Integrative Studies Historical Archive and Repository. The Chopra Foundation, along with a few others, are going to be helping them build and expand this database. Their concept is simple. Let's protect and preserve this knowledge objectively through citations and sources. Let's make this archive a donation to Wikipedia. Let's make sure this knowledge is represented without bias to the spirit and letter of Wikipedia's guidelines for all researchers and journalists. Let's solve this problem by contributing, not quarreling. They are now representing my work and biography on Wikipedia, and it has been interesting to see the reception that the representative from the archive is getting on my article talk page. Most of the skeptic editors on my article believe me to be a very dangerous man, and believe that it is Wikipedia's responsibility to warn the world of how dangerous my ideas are. They are giving my representative a hard time and are harassing other Wikipedia editors who jump in and try to help. Although this is sad to see, I have hope that in time this can be resolved with integrity through this approach. I believe that by working together and encouraging cooperative behaviors on Wikipedia, that all of this bitterness online can grow a little more productive. Wikipedia, let's work it out together.
Time has come to see the world as it is.
This article is Quantum Rainbows by Paul Levy, and it was posted to realitysandwich.com in 2017. The following is excerpted from Paul's upcoming book, The Quantum Revelation, A Modern-Day Spiritual Treasure. The appearance of a rainbow is made up of the interaction of raindrops, sunlight, and our consciousness. By itself, from its own side, a rainbow has no existence in our universe prior to being observed. This is to say that there is no intrinsic, independent, objective rainbow that exists separate from the observing consciousness. Being a function of our observation, if no one were there observing it, there would be no rainbow. There is no physical rainbow existing somewhere out there in space. The rainbow is only to be found within, and not separate from, the very mind that is observing it. The highest Buddhist teachings, and now quantum physics, says that our physical universe is similar in this regard to a rainbow. Just like a rainbow can't be said to exist until the moment that it is observed, quantum entities can't be said to exist until the moment of observation. The act of observation is truly creative. The quantum entities that make up what seems to be solid matter, let's use, for example, a tree, are no more like the thing we call a tree than the raindrops are like the thing we call a rainbow. Just as a rainbow is the outcome between the raindrops and our consciousness, the tree is the result of the interaction between the quantum entities that compose it and ourselves. This is to say that in the case of this seemingly solid three-dimensional world, there is one necessary ingredient, an observing consciousness. This isn't some New Age gobbledygook, but simply the logical outcome of following the insights of what quantum physics is revealing to us about the nature of the universe we live in. If more than one person is seeing a rainbow, there is an unexamined assumption that this means that the rainbow is really there, or that there is an objectively existing rainbow that they are all seeing. If a number of observers are seeing what seems to be one and the same rainbow, however, it is not accurate to say that they are seeing the same rainbow. A rainbow appears in a different place for each observer. In fact, when any one of us sees a rainbow, each of our eyes sees a slightly different rainbow. Its position is context-dependent rather than being innate. If we move, it moves. In a very real sense, there are as many rainbows as there are observers. Each observer is seeing their own private rainbow. It is as if there is an infinite superposition of rainbows existing in a state of potentiality, each one inhabiting a virtual world until the moment it is observed. Similar to how there is not one objective rainbow that exists as an object per se, quantum physics has discovered that there is no invariant way the universe really is. To quote Philip K. Dick, "For every person there is a different universe which is the result of a mutual participation between him and the macrocosm, a field that is a syzygy between them. There is no single reality that all observers share." Wheeler writes in his notebook, "The idea is surely not new that there is not one world but as many worlds as observers." Dick continues, "If reality differs from person to person, can we speak of reality singular? Or shouldn't we really be talking about plural realities? And if there are plural realities, are some more true or more real than others? What about the world of a schizophrenic? Are some of us more in touch with reality than others? It is easy to presume that the differences between people's worlds is caused entirely by the subjectivity of the various human viewpoints, or that people are just interpreting the one objectively existing world differently. Quantum physics suggests that our situation might, however, be one of plural realities superimposed onto one another, akin to the potentiality of the wave function, like so many film transparencies. At any given moment, based on our observation, one of these transparencies takes on substantial form and appears, to our mind, to be the real and therefore only existing reality, while the other potential universes disappear as if they never existed. The idea that there is an objectively existing world that we all share is a flawed assumption that creates the seemingly unsolvable paradoxes that riddle the quantum physics world. This state of affairs makes me think of how many conflicts in the world, both big and small, are the result of people arguing over the idea that their version of reality is the correct one, when in actual fact there is no true reality, other than the fact that there is no single true reality. To quote Bob Livingston, one of the founders of the discipline of neuroscience, "Our individual experiences are so different from one another that the world consists of a couple of billion people in a couple of billion worlds." If there are indeed plural realities, problems arise due to breakdowns of communication between the different realities. This puts the various conflicts in our world in a new context. Maybe instead of fighting among ourselves to determine who is in possession of the true reality, we can learn to build bridges to connect a multitude of realities. Quantum physics is such a bridge.
Time has come to see the world as it is.
This is called Psychedelic, Shamanic, and Magical Themes in Video Game Culture by Benton Rooks. It was posted to realitysandwich.com in 2015. Here's a quote from Marcus Boone. "The imaginal presents itself to us at certain moments as a realm in its own right, separating us from our sensory experience, independent of our will, but rich with meaning. I take it, as Plato did, that such imaginal realms are a fundamental, irreducible part of human experience. Both literature and certain psychoactive substances are strongly associated with such imaginal realms, and many believe that the dangers of the imaginal realms, such as they are, would be forever eradicated if certain methods of accessing them, art and psychoactive substances, were forever banned." Psychedelic filmmaker and comic creator Alejandro Jodorowsky believes that all symbols contained in art exist to remind us of our own potential in shamanic and spiritual mastery. Julius Evola's idea of parahistory was that myth represents metaphysical knowledge and that there were spiritual symbols latent in ancient civilizations to remind us of what we've lost. In this way, all narrative also functions as a form of healing shamanic psychotherapy. Like most of my generation, my first vivid interaction with artistic imagination mostly included slamming my digits at the tender age of 5 to the frantic chiptune glitch dance of the Amanita Muscaria-influenced Super Mario. This endlessly fun plastic hyperspace intersection of the game world still remains an instant reminder of how easy it is to forego the neurochemical pathways of the active imagination in conjunction with our innate birthright of interdimensional astral travel. As Winkleman says, video game imagery is innately connected with the psychedelic capacity of freeing the reptile brain with the intense neurochemical wash that rushes upon the brain when serotonin levels flood into the brain on psychedelics, effectively breaking down the biological guardians of neural pathways that limit the amount of information that may be received from the external or spirit world. This biochemical freedom leads directly to experiential access of limitless, direct astral imagination. Video games also relate to the causal plane, the realm in hyperspace beyond the Akashic records where any single metaphysical thought can create an entire universe one to live in, or be stuck in, as the soul must inevitably move past it in its acquisition of pure spirit. Pinchbeck's infamous meta-psychedelic commentary, 2002, dealt in detail with the limits of what he calls the consumer bandwidth and default rationalism in Western science in contrast to the psychedelic experience. But in the early 1900s, writers Ananda Kumaraswamy, Jean Gebser, René Guénon, Rudolf Steiner, and Egyptologist Schwaller de Lubitz also valued and wished to integrate the mythical and symbolic thinking of magical consciousness into this rather boring, consumer-oriented single-state consciousness we find ourselves stuck with. As Thomas B. Roberts says, the multi-state structure of consciousness was the default state for all of culture before the quote-unquote civilized West, which still stubbornly only utilizes and recognizes this single state of consciousness as valid. What psychedelics and psychoactive plants interpreted in conjunction with Winkleman's altered states of consciousness model and in connection with narrative therapy have the potential to do is connect us directly to the hyper-suggestible and childlike pre-verbal synesthesia. This prima materia of symbol-making consciousness itself, whereby all senses are blended into one, strips away the endless onion layers of mental covering and lays bare just how close pure consciousness in the infinite dazzling spirit-love world that lies just beyond the veil of endless sensory illusion is. Here the function of the symbol becomes more than an object of representation, and instead is used as a metaphysical tool to traverse the treacherous terrain of inner space itself. This psychospiritual apprehension of the Godhead is the equivalent to mastering Gebser's integral state of consciousness, as the previous stages of archaic, magic, mythical, and mental states of consciousness may be finally understood outside of mind and time. Rather than the contemporary psychological view of imagination as an individual fantasy world with no spiritual or practical import, Henry Corbin's view of the imaginal plane consisted of realizing it as an active spiritual world between the material and causal planes, with both benevolent and malevolent entities with a wholly other human agenda. In my previous article, Beyond the Machine Elves, I gave a brief overview of a new post-ironic cultural trend called entheodelic storytelling, a term influenced by Corbin's imaginal plane that I co-coined with two other reality sandwich staff writers, Jeremy Johnson and Rak Razam. This is a form of narrative therapy used in contemporary storytelling that is explicitly influenced by meta-psychedelic themes and the evolution of consciousness, as well as shamanic magical consciousness-altering techniques. The symbols of this trend are most obviously present in fantasy sci-fi literature and video game lore that imaginistically reflects Gebser's view of the mythical and magical states in the evolution of consciousness, a not-so-distant time when we were actually psychically powerful enough to throw fireballs and communicate telepathically with gods and animals alike. In his book Aya Awakenings, Razam, along with Jeffrey Kripal and John David Ebert, uses the geek metaphysics of solar hero alien shamanism to demonstrate it by an occult interpretation of Superman as a means of explaining McKenna's infamous archaic revival. The immersive imaginal nexus of video game culture indicates a latent and often unconscious desire to shamanize, to break free of the material plane and walk between the worlds of the imaginal and spiritual planes for healing and magical purposes. Like Sulianu, Lundborg, Ott, Razam, Rasch, and Winkleman, I argue here that psychoactive plant aids are irreducibly present, though not always necessarily needed, in the flight of the shaman, witch, or yogi, who is aided by ritual and ecstatic trance for otherworldly journeys. According to Rasch, we can no longer distinguish between the psychotechnology found in witchcraft, yoga, and shamanism except for the specifics of spiritual intent. Psychoactive plants relate to modern fiction in reminding us of the portals of power or healing and the rift zones of heaven on earth by enduring the treacherous underworld suddenly laid upon the outdated cosmology of the post-human Westerner. But we need not look very far into the past to see exactly how real magic operates outside of the fantasy context. Scandinavian magic and history. The first seeds of the occult revival were found in elemental witchcraft forever sealed in the first world mind by the dualistic Jedi-Sith distinction in Star Wars. But a postmodern gray magical system emerges in early New Wave fantasy literature and also when looking at the medieval context in Iceland's folklore. Scandinavian culture survived longer than most other pagan traditions, and it therefore leaves one of the most detailed pre-medieval examples of a still living magical tradition. Of course, Tolkien's theory of imagination first provided a way in which admirers of northern myth and folklore were able to use it as an access to the astral plane. As Tyndall has previously demonstrated, Tolkien took the ancient lore of the past in fantasy literature to provide a concrete map to the eternal interscape, not unlike the ways in which the modern psychonaut conspires to map and mythologize such seemingly daunting territory. As Rash indicates, dragons are one of the primary symbols of both guardians of the gate to inner space, but also the popular form of the hybrid shamanic animal, in the sense that their physiology represents astral flight with wings, while still being mortal and having grounded access to the material plane. Sigurd in the Volsung saga must actually bathe in the blood of the dragon in order to gain his own supernatural warrior abilities. In Shamanism in North myth and magic, Clive Tolley points out that battle between giants and magicians are synonymous with initiation into mastery over invisible shamanic powers. In addition to allowing access to the primeval power they represent when the ritual sacred setting for shamanic initiation is present. In the northern pagan tradition, we find two essential forms of magical practice in the poetic Edda and sagas known as Gendur and Seoror. According to Tolley, Gendur is an active form of Nordic stave magic, whereby the enchanted staff can allow both the conversation and manipulation of spirits. Outstanding examples of self-interested sorcery of this kind can be found in the Kalevala with Veinomen, as well as in Icelandic folklore with the sorcerer Seymundur the Wise, recalling Tolkien's Sarumandur, a sorcerer so powerful he could control the will of the devil himself. Seymundur mastered the art of sorcery at the Black School, an infamous magic school that allowed access to the forbidden red and black books of magic. Seor, as it was historically practiced, was primarily a female-dominated form of witchcraft used for ritualistic divination purposes and intertrance journeys to the other world. Though in the sagas we find that Freya taught Odin such forbidden magic, speculatively through a form of ecstatic sex magic. Ladvire brilliantly opens up the question beyond the ritualistic documentation of Seor to include a third category, Troldemor, known as the broader aspects of Scandinavian folk magic that, quote, covers a wide field of assumed abilities to change the visible reality by means invisible and unreachable to ordinary people. In most texts, Troldemur is said to generate destruction and harm and is almost always described from the perspective affected. With few exceptions, performances of Troldemur for the purposes of creating destruction, sickness, or misfortunes were clandestine and solitary activities, while the positive applications of such knowledge used in acts of divination were collective events executed more or less in public. Shamanism and magic in video games. With the digital media of the 21st century, we need not go very far in order to directly have participatory interface with the magical and mythical states of consciousness that the previous mentioned authors may have only been able to imagine as definitive stages in the evolution of consciousness. Most video games that have a central protagonist in linear storytelling, either in side-scrollers, RPGs, or shooters, hold cultural value as form of storytelling in that they represent a shamanic path to power. The gamer is tirelessly torn apart by demons or enemies, but also eternally resurrected in order to live extra lives, as Bissell says, or to achieve the heroic quest of immortality or the completion of the game of life itself. Dungeons & Dragons, and consequently the heavily influenced D&D Animation Adventure Time, along with countless other RPGs, have been heavily influenced by left-hand path occultism, but overt shamanic themes in the context of modern psychedelic culture are perhaps more difficult to tease out. Blacklight-influenced neon psychedelia began in the shiny mirror world of the Japanese Nintendo in 1985, whose shamanic themes are most commonly known in the mushroom-gobbling Super Mario series, but also in the more mature and complex lore of the Celtic myth-influenced Legend of Zelda. In Ocarina of Time, we find a mature development of the complex shamanic cosmology found ever-present in contemporary video game culture. Skyrim and the entirety of RPG's standard wizard role is influenced by alchemy as well as the pirate genre in regards to magical item hunting, and the player's digital avatar becomes a hero through potions, also known as the poison or green path. After Link acquires the Philosopher's Stone, represented as the Triforce of Courage in the OOT lore, the Triforce is a sacred relic that grants the wishes of its holder. Link also uses fairy-enchanted weapons and crafts magical songs, as Orpheus and Pythagoras did, to control the will of animals and foes with vibrations, in order to be triumphant in supernatural battles against otherworldly monsters of great power and sorcery. When Link places his magical sword within the altar, he is able to use the Triforce to travel into the White Void, not unlike the way modern Wiccans and other ceremonial traditions like the Golden Dawn use their altars to do path working on the inner planes with similar magical objects. The Triforce is the quintessential Trinity symbol, and therefore has value beyond its obvious Judeo-Christian reference to include two hidden shamanic themes. 1. Link saves his soul, Zelda holding the Triforce of Wisdom, by defeating Ganondorf, holding the Triforce of Power and symbolizing the satanic aspects of his mind, or the mind. 2. Like any warrior shaman archetype, Link masters his own mind with supernatural training, altering it with magical potions that give him extra life force, represented quaintly by extra health heart symbols in the game. He floods the neurophysiological guardians of the triune brain structure and uses magical weapons to cut past the illusions of the dualistic world, the two sides of his brain, and finally reach the non-dual white light of the metaphysical world. In the Nintendo 64's Majora's Mask title, the shamanic influence is present with masks, as in indigenous cultures, shamanic masks are not simply utilitarian but are used to, quote, represent or suggest his or her helper spirits. The altered appearance allowed the shaman to maintain a distance between himself or herself and the audience, and verified his or her special relationship with the supernatural. Edson. The time travel element, explicit in Zelda's complex lore and stretching across game titles in a non-linear fashion, is also indicative of the way in which shamans use inner dream time to access the Akashic records, a place folded within the inner space where all of space-time is seen from a single point and anything can be learned from either the ancient past or distant future. Trippy dark shaman themes are also buried in latent form in the notoriously challenging Souls trilogy. The player is torn apart and resurrected again with the aid of supernatural armor and weapons, uses shamanic meditation around magical fires to time travel, and must consult oracles in a mysterious ancient religion to defeat the hulking demons that await to assault with harrowing aggression. The recent dark fantasy video game Skyrim also demonstrates a still very active occult pagan landscape of Norse Seor, witchcraft, as well as being influenced by the vast landscape of the Icelandic magical tradition. In addition, the narrative of the game is also heavily influenced by the complex metaphysical system of draconian ruin magic, or magical power learned from occult combat with astral dragons. Both Norse and Icelandic mythology gruesomely depict raising the dead, summoning demons, interdimensional time portals, divination at sacred temples, and elemental magic as a stark historical reality, not very far from the supposedly fictitious fantasy genre that Bethesda markets the Elder Scrolls series as. Hazen Frotz distinguishes between 6 categories of magic primarily in use in the Norse tradition. Quote, incantatory magic, ruin magic, death magic, divinatory magic, cursing magic, and destructive magic. Cursing magic and destructive magic are categorized as impermissible sorcery, black magic. This has an almost direct correspondence to the 6 classes of magic in the Elder Scrolls series: illusion, alteration, destruction, conjuration, restoration, and mysticism. Price also sees one of the primary socio-historical functions of Seor as a form of spiritual battle magic. It's no secret that morally gray magical paths have also become a new trend in post-Game of Thrones fantasy fiction in line with the increasing popularity of anti-heroes in postmodern media generally. In my own genre-bending graphic novel trilogy Kali Yuga, the ancient elemental wizard Abrares must choose the gray path for survival purposes due to the world around him being entirely corrupt and filled with at least 15 magical foes who are equal to him in the use of the detailed void grid path. Dark Souls 2 features a distinctly gray Moorcock-esque protagonist having ties with the postmodern Elric series. There is also Geralt, the supernatural monster slayer in the video game series based on dark fantasy novel The Witcher, which directly models itself after Moorcock's infamous dark elf antihero. Dark fantasy tropes neatly fit into Raish's demon blood, bone trumpet, and magical daggers symbolic morphology found in Nepalese shamanism, a brutal reality that reflects the current ayahuasca and datura-influenced shamanic warfare found in the Amazon. But from a non-dual point of view, video game culture ironically points to the central goal of all yogic and shamanic practice to be union with the godhead or master of the spirits beyond the realm of opposites entirely. Trained master shamans with the proper intent and use the non-dual energetic grid space historically for socio-cultural healing, not unlike what Western psychology aims to do in the global shamanic resurgence or psychedelic renaissance in the rebirth of psychedelic psychotherapy. This cursory review of video game history demonstrates the pervasive historical and real-world applications of shamanism and sorcery that lie latent in many popular titles masquerading as mere fiction. What remains ultimately is an unconscious thirst for gnosis in the post-internet West that may not be quenched by the mere representation of geek metaphysics in media, but must instead be hard-won in the struggle to apprehend the invisible third eye of vision at the intersection of ancient and modern consciousness-altering techniques.
Science can explain everything if we look hard enough.
Shut up, science bitch.
Nothing is true. Everything is real.
Not only is he like ruining my life, but with all this God shit that he's into, he could be ruining my afterlife.
It's a sort of interdimensional vagina that somehow appears. I can interact with it.
Fabric of the entire universe could be torn apart.
I know my mind is changing. I'm already too far gone to know what to do.